everyone, my name is Kara Bernstein, and I am here at the Transformational CMO Assembly, our 10th edition, at the Four Seasons, Denver, Colorado. And I am joined by Anjali Lai. She is a senior analyst serving CMOs at Forrester Research. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So I want to start by hearing a little bit about how you fell into the research side of marketing and where you are now at Forrester.
Sure. So as you just mentioned, I'm a senior analyst at Forrester. I'm serving chief marketing officers. So all of the research that I do is focused on consumer behavior and consumer decision making, but in the name of helping CMOs be more successful in their role. I'm on the research side, meaning that I design and I conduct studies to understand how consumer behavior and decision making are changing. But the research is very applicable as well. And so it's always about how can these insights be applied to an executive level marketing strategy. And so my personal journey has been, I was a marketing practitioner very briefly in both the corporate and the nonprofit world. And then I just personally became very interested in the insights and strategy piece and realized that marketers are challenged to make extremely high stakes decisions extremely quickly, frequently, and the knowledge and sort of the deep research that often informs those isn't something that they have the luxury of doing themselves. And so I've moved into this role where I can work with CMOs and partner with them fairly consistently. We have long-term relationships that we're nurturing, and that helps me with the research, but I'm also conducting the research and answering the questions and sort of dealing with these tougher, sort of complex, sometimes abstract issues that will inform how how CMOs make choices and design strategies in the corporate or in the practical world.
Yeah, very interesting. So you led a session here in Denver, which was a great title, by the way, about finding your inner unicorn and all about how consumer purchase drivers are really setting the pace of innovation. So can you give us a glimpse into that? What was the main focus point there?
Yeah, absolutely. So that session was essentially a chance for me to talk about some of the latest research that I've been doing that's been unfolding on my team. And the research was inspired by the direct-to-consumer digital disruptors that we've seen sort of storm onto the scene in the past 10 years or so. So like the Warby Parkers and Caspers of the world that are telling really bold stories about how they have this direct-to-consumer channel and therefore this relationship, and they are threatening to topple some of the incumbents in their industries. And these brands have inspired a lot of consumer appeal, and our data shows that even though it's something like less than a third of U.S. online adults are actually buying from these firms today, right? They're still emerging to some degree. 9 in 10 consumers who bought from these companies say they'll buy from the company again, right? So in a world where loyalty is elusive and people are debating whether loyalty even exists anymore, to see a stat like that is quite significant. And so this research was looking into what about these companies is creating so much consumer appeal. Is it the story they're telling? Is it the fact that they're simply an emerging brand, a startup? Is it really a function of the channel strategy, the vertically integrated supply chain, which they talk about? Or is there something else? And therefore, what can the larger brands learn from these younger companies and then embed into their own decision making to stay relevant in a world where these companies are making a splash? So the research essentially found, and what we discussed in the session here at the conference, was that consumers are drawn to these D2C disruptors primarily because of this increasing willingness to experiment with new brands. So our data shows, for instance, that 10 years ago, 39% of US online adults said they were always willing to do or try new things. Today, 56% of consumers say the same thing. So that's a pretty dramatic jump, and it's a measurable change. And within that context, consumers are still weighing their purchases and their brand experiences against things like convenience, quality, perceived trustworthiness of the brand. That has always been the case. But we found that how consumers are defining these things is changing. And that's really what the session was about, is sort of like a look at the then and now of convenience, quality, and trust, and then a discussion about what this means in the context of how a large brand stays relevant and develops a closer tie to the consumer and delivers against these evolving purchase drivers today.
Now, speaking of then and now, I want to hear your thoughts on this ever-changing role of the CMO. Is it getting eliminated completely? Is it changing to chief brand or chief customer officer? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something my entire team, our full CMO team at Forrester, is of course keeping a very close eye on. We've seen over the past year, right, the number of CMO titles being reduced, and either CMOs are being recast as like a chief customer officer or chief brand officer or chief experience officer, or we see a merging of different functions. Whatever it is, that chief marketing officer role is the role title is becoming much more infrequent, right? Less popular. But ironically, what we're also seeing is that the functions that a chief marketing officer is responsible for are, of course, still important, probably more important today than ever before. And the reduction of the CMO title has, in fact, unleashed the power of the brand. So now you have folks in the customer experience organization or the product organization or even employee experience, or like the HR organization, that feel ownership over the brand and are now playing a role in defining what the brand means to them and sort of distilling the values of the brand and having that sort of trickle down through their own team. So the mandate or the functions that a CMO typically is responsible for are alive and well and are proliferating across the organization, but the actual title is not as common. And so I think what that means is that CMOs or whatever the title becomes formally called, or whatever the industry standard becomes, are going to have to really think much bigger about brand outside of the function of a traditional marketing organization. So we see CMOs, for instance, taking over much more responsibility when it comes to the customer's experience. So there's this agreement that marketing is not only about acquisition or the earlier phases in the purchase journey, but it's also about what happens after the customer is brought in, when they're engaging with the brand, when they're coming back to the brand. We've seen the CMO now take or play a much bigger role in the employee experience, and I thought it was fitting, even at this conference, the CMO from Microsoft USA, she started by talking about culture. That was the first pillar. I thought that was so relevant and so significant, in that all of a sudden the CMO is responsible for the employee's interpretation of the brand. And I think that that's becoming a more formal progression as well in terms of the operational structure of the company.
It's exciting.
Yeah, exciting, challenging.
So you did something quite interesting recently at Forrester, which was releasing the first set of predictions for the customer in 2020. Good timing. We're at the end of 2019. Everyone's curious what's next. And it's all about how the consumer needs and expectations are shaping approach to brands and technology. And so what's the difference going to be between last year and now and then next year?
Yeah. So at Forrester, we've been publishing predictions at the end of, towards the end of every year. But as you said, this is the first time in the company's history that we are publishing predictions specifically about the customer. And there are a number of reasons for that. We have a lot more data now. The conversation about how consumers are changing, that conversation is becoming more top of mind because customers are changing so quickly. Like, change itself is increasing, is accelerating. So what we've found and what we're basically positing in this predictions document is that essentially consumers have so much available to them today, right? The pace of innovation has been astounding, right? And we don't have to it's not rocket science. We don't have to look too far to know that, some of the technologies that are available to us today that are on the market are phenomenal. Like, we carry this incredibly powerful computer in our pocket right every day in the form of our mobile phone. Consumers have an incredible amount of power today as compared to, what they were able to do 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so when you look at that, it's very easy to say that the consumer's world is awesome. Like, the consumer's world is, fantastic. They have options available to them. They can look for any brand or for any product they want from any corner of the world, purchase it for any price. And so this is a really sort of good picture. But despite all of that, consumer happiness levels haven't changed at all. Those are consistent. Or in some cases, they've gone down. So the tension that we were really interested in and kind of intrigued by is that even though consumers have more, especially by way of technology and digital experiences and things like that that are available to them, they aren't any happier. And what that means is that people who are providing these technologies, experiences, brands, any sort of that commercial value, are missing something that customers really need, right? There was a blind spot in this journey. And now what we're seeing is that consumers are responding to that missed need or that unfulfilled need and demanding for companies to, for example, take a stand on values or prioritize the emotional element of a digital experience. There's this pendulum swing towards having a human-like interaction. And so what that tells us is that, even though consumers have all of these great things, these products and services and experiences were designed without fulfilling this need for purpose and sort of meaning and a feeling of being connected to a greater whole and having a consumer's actions impact the sort of greater good or a larger community. And that's a very kind of fundamental human truth. Actually, you can look at, biology or neurology, sociology, and sort of other disciplines that study the human being, and you'll see that this feeling of being connected is so critical. It's an evolutionary force. And that's something that our technologies and brands have failed to deliver today or satisfy today. And so the rising cry from consumers to feel this connection again, we believe or predict is going to put pressure on brands to actually start to take that seriously and start to fulfill that need. So, I think one of the headlines or one of the titles in the report is something like, consumers are anxious and they feel lost, but they're incredibly hungry to connect. And that's the piece that's going to drive the difference between brands that are super smart about their customers and are giving them what they need, not just in terms of a functional benefit, but an emotional benefit, and then the brands that are kind of lagging behind.
Well, congratulations. It's a really exciting project to be working on.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you again so much for being at the Millennium Alliance Assembly. We were happy to have you and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for
so
having
much.
me.